Hello, everyone. I'm back again for another Handyman Sportscast, and I do have some really cool topics to discuss today. I just love this time of year. I don't know about you guys. And usually this time of year, I start going back to watch the old college football games from last season. How many of you actually do this? How many of you that listen to this actually do this? When I share this, like it, tell me that you actually do this. On my schedule for today, or at least when I preparing this, was I was happened to be watching the Texas A&M and Duke game. That was the Chick-fil-A Bowl. And some of you might remember that game as the infamous Johnny Manziel jumping over his own lineman to score a touchdown, and what helped really turn around that game. And then also I watched the Rose Bowl from this past year with Stanford and Michigan State. And man, what games those were. I was thoroughly entertained, even though I already knew the outcome of those games. But man, sometimes just watching those old college football games, it just gets you pumped up and gets you excited. Well, today I have some really good things I want to talk to you guys about. And so me talking to you guys about some of these old football games I like to watch, some of these old college football games, is really going to help segue into what I'm going to talk about today. I guess you could go ahead and call this the college football portion of this podcast, or the sportscast, if you will. Let's just go ahead and segue right into my first topic. Okay, pop quiz for all of you. How do you tick off the Southeastern Conference? I want you guys to think about that for a second. If there could be a way to tick off the Southeastern Conference, how would you do it? I mean, some of you might say that their 7-year dominance is over. We all remember that this past year, Florida State finally knocked off Auburn, ending the dominance that the SEC had, so to speak, if you will. Some of you will be like, well, Florida State is practically an SEC school, and you won't get much of an argument out of me. But if you were to say that, I would be wrong. So what is it? Well, the answer is just do what Penn State head coach James Franklin did and be involved in a Georgia State football camp. Now, when I say Georgia State, I don't just mean like the state of Georgia. I mean Georgia State University. I first heard about this story when I read it on btn.com. Apparently, there is a rule in the NCAA rulebook that states no schools or schools can run or host any sort of camp out of state more than 50 miles from campus unless they are invited. And that's exactly what we have here. James Franklin and Penn State University announced last month that they would be working with recruits at a Georgia State camp in Atlanta on June 10th. In roughly about 7 days. So in about a week from today, Penn State will be in the state of Georgia at this camp. I guess this sort of thing does actually happen a lot. I've actually never heard about this, but apparently it happened. I never knew about it. Apparently, too, according to several reports, Oklahoma and Oklahoma State, they do this same thing with working with smaller schools in Texas. So why is this such a big story? Why am I making a big deal about this? It's because of the hilariousness of how the SEC is responding to this. That's why I'm making such a big deal about this, and this is why it's such a big story. One, it's in Atlanta, Georgia. It's an SEC hotbed for recruiting. And because it's James Franklin. For those of you that remember, James Franklin just left Vanderbilt, where he dared to beat the teams in the SEC and out-recruit them. And he did this for 3 seasons at a school that is considered the Ivy League of education that plays in the SEC. James Franklin went 24-14 overall and was 11-13 in SEC play, along with 3 straight bowl trips. Now the SEC wants the NCAA to close this loophole that allows schools to take part in football camps in their backyard. During the SEC spring meetings, Georgia football head coach Mark Richt, who recruits Atlanta harder than most teams, maybe with the exception of the other Atlanta school and Georgia Tech, made this comment, quote, "There have been a lot of schools doing that for years. The spirit of that NCAA rule is not to have satellite camps all over the place." Kentucky's head coach, Mark Stoops, he kind of had a different approach to this. He had a different feeling towards this. He said during these same meetings, but from what I heard in there is most of our coaches would be in favor of at least being on an even playing field. Translation, if you don't close the loophole, then lift the ban on guest coaches at other campuses. SEC Commissioner Mike Slibe, it's that kind of thing that gets us to think about our rules. They, SEC coaches, like out rules. They don't like the so-called satellite camps. They see it as a loophole and asked us to see what we can do about that. He also said that the conference would approach the NCAA about closing the loophole. The funny thing about all this, as I've digested this whole thing, the funny thing about this is the 2 schools that don't seem to have an issue with this is both the Atlanta schools, Georgia State, who invited James Franklin, and Georgia Tech. I think I know why these schools don't care. Georgia Tech is transitioning to the FBS. Then they see working with Penn State as an opportunity to sell their program in front of one of the more prominent programs. There's no better way. If you're Georgia State, if you're looking at it and going, look, we're in Atlanta. We have to recruit against the SEC and ACC in both retrospects. We have to compete against Georgia and Georgia Tech. So we'll bring in Penn State to work with some of these recruits while introducing Penn State to some of these other recruits. Kind of a win-win, if you will. And frankly, Georgia Tech don't care because one is Georgia State, and two, Penn State is still under probation, so the chance of them taking many of their players is very unlikely. I mean, in all honesty, it's a Georgia State football camp. Tech is still the big bad dog in that city, and until State beats someone that of noteworthy, Tech won't be sweating it. They're not gonna care. Penn State's at a Georgia State camp. That's cool. We're Georgia Tech. We've won the ACC. We've played in a BCS bowl game. We've been to bowl games as well. It's Georgia State. So we're not worried about it. But Penn State's head coach, he understands. He knows what he's doing. I mean, come on, think about it. He recruited at Vanderbilt. He knows what he has to do to win there. I'll address this here in a few minutes. But in some ways, him recruiting at Penn State is almost very similar to recruiting what he had to do at Vanderbilt. Vanderbilt has very strict guidelines to get into that school. Like I said, it's an Ivy League school in the southeastern region of the United States. Franklin's area where he could recruit players was very limited because of that. Now you think about him going to Penn State, he's still under probation. He's still having a program that can't recruit at a continuous high level as the rest of his Big Ten brethren. As long as the NCAA and the Big Ten Conference will allow it, then he's going to do it. This is what Franklin told some reporters in Pennsylvania. The Big Ten and the NCAA rules allow you to do these things. We wanted to not only have camps on our campus, which we're going to have a bunch of them, but also be able to maybe take the Penn State brand and be able to take it to parts of the country that maybe young men and families won't be able to make it to our place and take it to them. I'm fired up about it. Well, frankly, I guess you could tell he's not alone in about being fired up. That's for sure. The SEC coaches, they're not excited about it, but this has gotten them fired up because they're like, no, this is our backyard. You are not welcome. This is great. And at the same time, so is Georgia State head coach Trent Miles. Here's my take. As you could probably guess, this is just making me laugh. And I just want to say, what's the matter, SEC? Are you afraid of Penn State and James Franklin? Are you afraid that your dominance is slowly coming to an end? I mean, why else would you be so mad about a school on probation, has major scholarship limits, basically to the point where they're no better than an FCS school? I mean, they have the same numbers as Indiana State, North Dakota State, Sam Houston State, so on and so on, these various FCS schools. And more importantly, they can't even go to a bowl game or even compete for a conference crown until 2015 and 2016. SEC, I say this to you. If you think that's unfair, then I say you do the same thing that the Big Ten does. Put a cap on a number of players a school can recruit and do away with oversigning, because we know that's what the SEC does. Every SEC school does it. It's not just Alabama and Auburn. It's LSU. It's Georgia. It's Florida. It's all of them. They all do this. We know that. They're notorious for it. But we all know that the SEC won't do that because they want to keep the competitive advantage. They know we're the SEC. We are basically the NFL minor leagues of college sports. We have the best athletes. We have the best players. We have the track record that proves that. And more importantly, and they just don't want to give the impression that the SEC is vulnerable. But after Auburn lost in the title game, the SEC is very vulnerable. They may not want to say it. They may not want to believe it. But after watching the past couple bowl games and bowl seasons, I've been saying it. The SEC is, some of these other schools, they're starting to slowly catch up to the SEC. And so when I look at it, the SEC, they need to win this year's playoff. Otherwise, the SEC's dominance will become nothing more than a myth. A folklore, a wise tale. Well, I think you get the point. SEC, it's your move. You can go ahead and you can close this loophole. I can understand why you would want to close this loophole because, again, you don't want the idea of recruits leaving your region. You don't like the idea that these other smaller schools are going to utilize some of these other bigger programs. And you think about it, like I said, Georgia State's using this to sell their program. And they have to. When you're in Atlanta, I mean, you're in the heart area of a very tough and rugged recruiting section of the country. Schools from all over the country camp out in the city of Atlanta and throughout the state of Georgia. So for Georgia State, they know they have to do something that will make them unique, that will make them a little bit different. Sure, some of these recruits, they may actually be coming to Georgia State just to see Penn State. But in the meantime, they get to see Georgia State. They get to go back to their homes. They get to go back to their other teammates and say, hey, I went up to Georgia State this weekend, and let me tell you, that campus is really nice. They have some really cool coaching staffs. I think I might be interested in wanting to go there. But let's continue to talk about college football for a little bit. I mean, who doesn't love to talk about college football on June 3rd? It's June 3rd, and we're talking about college football. If that doesn't get you pumped up, I don't know what will. I don't know how to get you excited if I can't get you excited to talk about college football on June 3rd of 2014. There's a story that's been kind of going around in this region, and I may take a little flack for this, but since I'm out in the Mountain West area, there's a story that I want to talk about, and that was a couple weeks ago, the Power 5 conference is stating as worthy as a quality non-conference opponent. One of those teams that was named was the BYU Cougars, and out here, it made all sorts of headlines. For those of you that may not know, last time I've addressed you guys and I've said, reporting from Rexburg, Idaho, that's because I'm attending the University of BYU, Idaho, the sister school to BYU. Reading the stories about BYU and all that, we get that a lot out here. This story made a lot of headlines. And now, I realize many of you out there listening to this right now, you might be rolling your eyes at me and just saying, who really cares? And to be honest with you, if I were listening to this, I probably would be feeling the same way. Well, I'll try not to bore you too much, but this is a story that I actually do have a ton of opinions on. When you look at their schedule this season, before I do this, I guess the easy thing would be to say to BYU, if you want to be taken seriously, and I'm going to explain this more, you have to win. You have to start winning. BYU as a program, they're very respectable. BYU has been known to put out these quality players, and that's not what this is about. As a program as a whole, there just hasn't been a lot of movement with this program. And if this program is serious about saying, we are the Notre Dame of the West, because that's the whole reason they went to the independents, because the Pac-12 didn't want BYU. They didn't want BYU, they wanted Utah. So they went there because they had to lead the Mountain West. So I want everyone to just look at the schedule. I'm going to tell you about BYU's schedule this year, and this is why I'm going to tell you guys why I kind of find this story so fascinating, and why when you look at their schedule this season, they are one of few teams I would put as having a great chance of going undefeated. This is just purely speculative. I'm not predicting that BYU will, but when you look at their schedule, there are the possibilities there. So here's how it starts off. Week 1, they travel to UConn. Week 2, they have to travel to Texas. 5 days later, they come back to play Houston. And then next week, they host Virginia. They get a bye week, and then on a Friday night, they play Utah State at home. Following week, they travel to Central Florida. Then they come home to play Nevada, travel to Boise State, travel to Middle Tennessee State, get another bye week, and then their last 3 games, home against UNLV, home against Savannah State, and finally travel to Cal. Not exactly a cakewalk, I realize, but if they can get by that second game, the rest of the schedule isn't very challenging. I look at the rest of the schedule, if they beat Texas, there's not really a team on there that I feel like BYU is going to be an underdog. Central Florida could be an exception. Cal could be another one, depending upon what type of team Cal is throughout the year. Again, we're trying to forecast what a team's going to look like on June 3rd of 2014. Never an easy thing to do. But when you just look at the rest of the schedule, it's not very challenging. There isn't a game on this list that I just don't feel that BYU won't be favored in. We know that Texas is the biggest game on the schedule, and they have to win that game. They win that game, Houston will be a tough challenge to be a pretty good team, and Virginia should be a pretty solid team. But again, those games are in Provo. For the most part, some of these other teams that have come up there, they've struggled. Many of them they can't deal with the altitude. But neither of those teams are going to make a lot of noise in their respective conferences. Neither Houston nor Virginia. Houston, I would probably think would probably be in the upper half of the AAC conference this year. They have a good young quarterback that's coming back this year for them. And, well, Virginia, they got to have a big year. Otherwise, their head coach, may be getting fired at the end of this year. Utah State has a good quarterback in Chucky Keaton, and if he's healthy, he can cause all sorts of problems for BYU. Central Florida, while on paper, won't be the same team that they were last year, at least not on offense, but that doesn't mean that they will be overlooked. Nevada should be an easy win. Boise State is always tough on the Smurf turf, and last time BYU traveled there, they lost 7-6. Middle Tennessee won't move a lot of meters on the college football radar, but that could be a trap game. UNLV and Savannah State should be both cakewalks, and then there's a trip to Cal. Now, again, I'm going to reiterate this, and I'll reiterate this later on too. This all depends upon if whether or not BYU can beat Texas. If BYU cannot beat Texas, then this doesn't matter. Then none of this matters. Then basically what has already been said by the Power 5 conferences will be proven true. Looking at Cal, no, Cal won't be I wouldn't even say Cal right now is even a Pac-12 dark horse right now. But this has the feel of a 5-6 Cal team. I mean, I can look at this game and I could just go, this is a game that you could have a Cal team coming into this game that they're 5-6. They need to make a bowl game. Their new head coach that's been there his second year, his program has to take the next step, especially in the Pac-12, especially where you have a team like Stanford, and Oregon right now for that matter, that are pretty much well dominating the conference. Cal has that opportunity that they can climb up a little ways. So this could be an opportunity for them. So they could be looking to make a huge push for next season and look to make an upset. Now, as I've said before, again, this all depends if they don't overlook or play sloppy at UConn on week 1. And if they pull off the biggest upset in the Bronco Mendenhall era by winning at Texas. Now, I know there are some of you that will say, well, Bronco's had plenty of those upsets throughout his career. He's beaten UCLA. He has beaten Oregon State. He's beaten Oklahoma. He's already beaten Texas. Those are very valid points, and I completely agree with you. But this is a road game at Texas. Whether or not Texas is relevant this year, whether or not Texas will be in the national championship discussions this year or next year or even 3 years down the road does not matter. Why? Because they're the University of Texas. Texas has the name. Their name carries them everywhere. When you see the Longhorns on the side of those helmets, business is about to pick up. So if they can do that, then I will say this. You better watch out for the Cougars because there may not be another game after that they won't be favored to win. And I know I've kind of repeating myself that. Now there is actually talk that BYU might try to play Alabama next season. But the problem would create an uneven split and a murderous September slate for that matter. I mean, here's the first month for BYU season next. BYU first plays at Nebraska, has a home game against Boise State, and then finishes the month at Michigan. That would mean they would sandwich a game between Boise State and Michigan. That would most likely mean a 1-3 start for the Cougars. Plus, that would mean that they would only have 5 home games and 7 road games. Not an ideal situation, but when you're a team like BYU, who isn't viewed as the same as the rest of the Power 5, along with Notre Dame, then this is worth taking the risk. I've had this thought in my head. If I'm BYU, I'm taking this opportunity. If I'm the AD of BYU, I'm telling my fans, sorry, we're not going to have a 6th home game, but instead, we are going to take our team to Tuscaloosa, Alabama, to play the Tide. Right now, BYU, you don't have much that you can come to the table and say, we're BYU and we demand this, this, and this. Sorry, BYU, you're not in that boat right now. You do not have that luxury right now. But with taking this game, it would mean a huge step. So yes, you would only get 1 home game in September, but that's not an entirely bad thing. But when you think about it, BYU, you get 3 chances to beat Power 5 opponents on the road. This is exactly what BYU needs to reverse the idea that they aren't a worthy non-conference opponent. Those of us that follow BYU, we know that they have a very rich history as a program. We know that this is a team that their fans travel, and when their bowl game is announced, their fans, they buy the tickets, they travel, they go to the games, they make their presence known while they're there. But again, The rest of the country, they just don't see that with BYU. If you're BYU, this is what you have to do. You absolutely have to take this game. If you're BYU and you don't take this game, you're crazy. You have blown that opportunity. Take your 5 home games next year and make them work. Because again, this year, you have a great chance. Get by Texas in week 2, you have a great chance the rest of the season to really make an impact for your program. You know, going undefeated in the first year of the playoff's existence is something that recruits are going to notice. And then plus, no better way to sell your program than to make a partnership with Alabama. Get Alabama on the schedule. Nebraska, Michigan, Texas, those are good schools. Notre Dame, those are good schools to have on your schedule. But Alabama, the SEC, there is something special with that. And if you're BYU, you have to take this opportunity and do something with it. However, there is now another story that I'm sure many of you have heard about. And again, I'm sorry that I'm staying on this BYU topic right now. But there is another story that many of you have probably heard about, and that is the story being investigated for improper benefits. Last week, it was reported that the university and the NCAA has been investigating former director of football operations, Dwayne Busby, who surprisingly quit earlier this year. The allegations are that Busby gave players, mostly offensive skilled players, discounted or free rent-free housing, free meals, and other gifts. One person that has been linked to this is former wide receiver Cody Hoffman, who has denied allegation and most not really surprisingly, has refused to talk to reporters as well as BYU. Most likely, since BYU won't get much, but a probably slap on the wrist, since BYU doesn't really have a history of being investigated by the NCAA. And more importantly, since they are working with the NCAA. They're probably still going to get some sort of probation, probably some sort of loss of TV money. There's probably also the possibility of them losing out on some scholarship players for the next maybe 2-3 seasons. But again, it won't be anything that's really significant. This is one that I will say that I'll probably be watching pretty closely, and whenever the announcement comes, and I imagine it could come pretty quickly, but again, it's still in the early stages of an investigation. So, and knowingly how sometimes these things work, how fast these sort of things move, we know that it's going to take a little bit of time before we really hear a verdict. So I'll be keeping my eye out on this. So with college football now only 3 months away, I'm already excited to see what will happen this year. And I think you can already tell that. And again, when the college football magazines come out later this month, and they're going to be coming out, and I don't know about you guys, but for me, when I get my college football magazines, it's like Christmas Day. I absolutely just love getting them and absolutely just opening up the pages and just flipping through there and just reading everything. What are these quote-unquote experts saying about some of these teams? But however, don't sleep on this summer either. We all know that the NBA Finals and the Stanley Cup Finals are set. You know, the NBA Finals, the Miami Heat will now be playing the San Antonio Spurs in a rematch from last year. You know, the Heat will be making their 4th consecutive trip to the NBA Finals. And in the Stanley Cup playoffs, we have the New York Rangers taking on the Los Angeles Kings. This is the first time that the Stanley Cup has featured 2 teams from the Los Angeles market and the New York market. Those are going to be pretty exciting. My predictions for those, I'm still going to take the Heat in 7. I mean, I'm not going to be one bit surprised if the Spurs don't win this. The Spurs have had just an unbelievable season. And I would love to see Tim Duncan get his 5th championship. And then in the Stanley Cup playoffs, I have to take the New York Rangers. Love this story. Love this team. We also have the College World Series. That's going on currently right now. The NCAA tournament for the men's Division I college baseball tournament. The Super Regionals will be taking place this Friday through Monday, and the winners of these games will be traveling to Omaha, my hometown, where they will take part in the annual College World Series to determine the national champion in college baseball. And how could we not mention one of the biggest tournaments in the world, one of probably the granddaddy of them all, of all tournaments, the FIFA World Cup. I absolutely love watching the World Cup. I think it's exciting. I think it's cool. At least for the question here for those of us that do follow the national team, the U.S. team, can the U.S. get out of its group stage, or the group of death, I guess is what they call it? Can they win this? If I had to predict, I would say that they're going to have to beat 2 of 3 of their opponents and maybe tie another. In the U.S., again, and we all heard about the headlines too earlier last week. Landon Donovan not going to be part of the team. That's complete shocker to me. I can't believe that. I can't fathom that Landon Donovan will not play in this year's World Cup. In many people's eyes, the golden boy for U.S. soccer isn't even going to play this year. I think that's a huge mistake there, and hopefully their manager, hopefully this decision doesn't come back to haunt them. And for those of you that love baseball like myself, then the season is already appearing to be a good one. So that's something to watch this summer. So before we all know it, we're going to be talking about the media days, then the start of fall camp / two-a-days. And then on August 3rd, the season for college football will start. If you're not watching sports, if you're not watching a game somewhere, I don't know why you're listening to this podcast then. Do thank you if you're actually out there listening to me. And until next time, reporting from Rexburg, Idaho, I'm Craig Handy, saying good night. And hey, as I like to now say, go catch a ball game.